46 years ago today, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald sank in Lake Superior. All 29 crew members aboard died. It was the largest ship to ever sink in the Great Lakes. Resting place is now 530 feet below the lake's surface, allowing only experienced divers with expensive submersible vehicles to visit her.
The underwater drone drifted slowly through the blackness of Lake Superior, its lights cutting pale tunnels into the depths. It descended toward a structure that had fascinated divers, historians, and the public for nearly half a century, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The massive freighter, once a proud carrier of iron ore, had vanished, taking all 29 men on board with her. The drone, sleek and bristling with sensors, moved in with precision, capturing images and data that no human eye had yet been able to see. And what it revealed was something that stirred awe, dread, and unease in equal measure. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The Edmund Fitzgerald rests in two main sections on the lakebed, more than 500 feet down. Over decades, images taken by submersibles and sonar had provided glimpses of her twisted hull and shattered decks. Yet much of her interior remained hidden, sealed off by darkness and the sheer inaccessibility of the site. This new mission, however, was designed to change that. Equipped with high-definition cameras, sonar mapping tools, and delicate robotic arms, the drone was capable of slipping into narrow passages, exploring the corridors and compartments where men once worked, ate, and slept. As it slid inside through a jagged breach in the hull, the silence of the lake's deep waters pressed in, broken only by the hum of its motors and the faint crackle of communications sent to the surface. At first, the drone's cameras revealed the expected: twisted beams, collapsed bulkheads, and the scattered debris of a ship torn apart by overwhelming natural forces. Rust had painted everything in shades of deep red and brown, and delicate formations of bacteria clung like lace to the steel surfaces. But then, deeper inside, as the drone adjusted its lights to illuminate long-forgotten spaces, the wreck began to tell a more unsettling story. Chairs, still bolted to the floor, sat askew at impossible angles, as if frozen mid-motion by the moment the ship broke apart. A galley table, its surface still faintly recognizable beneath the corrosion, leaned against a wall. Fragments of equipment, personal items, and unidentified objects lay scattered across the deck plates, trapped in a tableau of catastrophe. The deeper the machine went, the stranger the atmosphere became. The walls of certain passageways seemed unnaturally warped, the metal torn back in ways that suggested more than simple stress from sinking. There were cavities twisted inward rather than outward, as though something had crushed the steel with an almost deliberate force. It was a disturbing sight, hinting at energies and pressures that exceeded even the violent storm that had doomed the vessel. For decades, theories had swirled about how exactly the Fitzgerald met its end. Was it a rogue wave? A structural failure? Cargo shift? The drone's footage stirred these questions anew, showing evidence that seemed to defy conventional explanations. In one section, the drone slipped into what had once been the crew's quarters. The cramped, utilitarian space was eerily intact, despite decades underwater. Bunks jutted out from the walls, some frames still upright while others had collapsed. Drawers hung open as though rummaged through, yet no one had been there since 1975. The drone's camera lingered on a rust-caked clock, its hands frozen at a particular moment, suggesting it had stopped the instant the ship was torn apart. More unnerving still were the shadows the drone's lights cast against the warped walls, shapes that seemed to move when the drone itself did not. While rational minds explained this as nothing more than light distortion in the murky water, the effect was profoundly unsettling for those watching the live feed. As the exploration continued, the drone came upon areas that suggested the ship's internal collapse had been far more violent than earlier understood. Entire bulkheads were torn clean away, not sheared in straight lines, but ripped jaggedly as though clawed by some invisible force. Pipes were bent and curled, wrapped around each other in grotesque spirals. In one corridor, the drone found what looked like a massive breach from the inside out, metal plates peeled back like paper. This discovery sent waves of unease among the observers topside. Such damage hinted at enormous stresses, ones that ordinary maritime physics struggled to account for. If the storm alone had caused it, then the storm must have been far more powerful and unpredictable than anyone had realized. Even more chilling was the sense of presence inside the wreck. The drone, of course, carried no emotions. Yet the human operators reported a palpable weight in the air, or rather in the water, that seemed to radiate from the ship itself. Every hallway and compartment appeared to bear silent witness to the last terrifying moments of the Fitzgerald. The men aboard had no time to abandon ship, no chance to signal distress beyond a final, garbled transmission. Now their absence was felt most strongly in the places where they had lived. A coffee mug, its handle broken, rested in a corner. A torn piece of cloth, possibly from bedding, fluttered slightly in the drone's wake. These remnants, preserved in the cold, oxygen-poor depths, were unsettling reminders of lives interrupted abruptly and forever. The drone pushed onward into the engine room, a cavernous space filled with corroded machinery. Here the destruction was even more dramatic. Giant engines, once thundering with power, now lay in twisted disarray. Gears the size of doors were bent like toys. Shafts that should have resisted immense pressures were broken clean through. And amidst it all, there were voids. Sections where equipment seemed to have been ripped away, leaving behind only jagged traces. Theories abounded in real time among those observing. Could it have been the violence of the lake itself, exerting crushing pressure as the ship descended? Or was there something else, something less easily explained, that had contributed to the terrifying destruction within? As the drone moved into the cargo hold, the sight became even more haunting. Ore pellets lay scattered in piles, some neatly collected, others spilling like frozen waterfalls from ruptured walls. But what drew the most attention were the cavities within the hold. Some sections looked as though massive forces had struck from below, pushing upward and bursting through layers of steel and stone. The lakebed around the wreck had shown similar disturbances, unusual gouges and patterns in the silt. Observers noted that these marks suggested movement, as if the wreck had been shifted after it settled. This was particularly troubling as it hinted at ongoing geological or hydrodynamic processes at work, processes powerful enough to disturb a 729-foot freighter lying silent on the bottom. There was also something about the stillness of the interior that magnified the terror. Unlike open wrecks where water moves freely, much of the Fitzgerald's interior remained unnervingly stagnant. Silt clouds hung motionless until the drone disturbed them. Objects that should have drifted long ago remained in their places, as if time itself had slowed or stopped in those compartments. The airless voids created an atmosphere that seemed to exist outside normal conditions. For those watching the feed, it felt less like observing history and more like staring into a tomb sealed against the passage of decades. One of the most startling discoveries came when the drone approached the bow section, sliding beneath collapsed decks and through narrow openings. In a chamber near the forward compartments, it captured images of structures that looked oddly arranged. Beams and plates had fallen in patterns that did not align with the expected physics of a collapse. Instead, they formed shapes that seemed almost deliberate, jagged arcs crossing each other like skeletal ribs. It was as if the ship itself had been twisted into grotesque new forms by the pressures of the deep. The sight was not merely disturbing, it carried an air of the unnatural, as though the wreck concealed secrets too vast and too grim to be fully comprehended. Throughout the mission, the drone relayed not just visual data but acoustic readings as well. And here too, the findings were unsettling. The wreck emitted faint vibrations, low rumbles that were picked up by sensitive instruments. While some attributed this to shifting sediments or distant geological activity, others noted the uncanny timing of the sounds, which often coincided with the drone's approach to certain compartments. To the human ear, when filtered and played back, the noises carried an almost vocal quality, rising and falling like a breath in the silence of the lakebed. Rational explanations were offered quickly, yet the impression lingered that the ship itself was not entirely silent after all. The implications of these findings were immense. On a practical level, they provided new data about how large freighters could fail under extreme conditions, shedding light on structural vulnerabilities and hydrodynamic forces. But beyond the scientific, the mission stirred something deeper, an unease that went beyond engineering. The wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald had always carried a weight of mystery, a sense that its story was not fully told. Now, with images from inside its broken hull, that feeling only intensified. The drone had revealed not only the physical destruction but the haunting atmosphere preserved within. It showed a world where human presence had vanished in an instant, leaving behind spaces frozen in silent testimony. As the exploration concluded and the drone made its slow ascent back to the surface, those who had watched were left shaken. The Fitzgerald was more than just a wreck. It was a monument to forces both natural and unfathomable. What lay inside her, beyond the twisted metal and corroded machinery, was a sense of dread, as if the lake itself had chosen to keep its secrets sealed within her walls. The terrifying discoveries did not bring closure, nor did they solve the mystery in any final way. Instead, they deepened the sense of awe and fear, reminding all who bore witness that the deep places of the world still hold truths we may not be ready to face. The wreckage of the Edmund Fitzgerald has always existed at the crossroads of legend and history, but as the underwater drone pressed deeper into the silent halls of the sunken ship, the nature of its revelations began to transcend both. The drone's descent into unexplored chambers marked more than just a technical achievement. It was a journey into a place where the normal laws of time and decay seemed to lose their grip. To add to the strangeness, the lake itself seemed almost complicit in the preservation of this dark sanctuary. At such depths, oxygen is scarce, light is non-existent, and the temperature remains close to freezing year-round. Together, these conditions have slowed the processes of decay, holding much of the ship in a state eerily untouched by the decades since it sank. As the drone shifted into compartments no human diver could ever safely reach, the cameras revealed the eerie outlines of machinery coated in a thin sheen of bacterial mats that glowed faintly when illuminated. This phenomenon, though a product of microbial life feeding off the iron of the hull, seemed almost supernatural in effect. The glow was faint and ghost-like, painting the wreck's insides with an otherworldly sheen. For those watching on the surface, it felt less like science and more like stepping into a realm where nature had become indistinguishable from myth. The imagery was haunting, as if the ship had grown veins of its own, glowing with some strange, internal life. In the forward passageways, the drone found itself surrounded by objects that told of the human presence once so vibrant aboard. A metal locker, long rusted and fused shut, still bore the faint outline of a label stenciled decades ago. A pair of boots rested side by side beneath a collapsed bunk, eerily undisturbed as though awaiting their owner's return. A safety helmet, cracked and discolored by rust, drifted slowly in the current stirred by the drone's thrusters. These artifacts were not remarkable in themselves. They were ordinary objects of work and life at sea. Yet in this environment, their survival felt almost accusatory, as though they whispered of routines shattered in an instant, of lives halted mid-motion. The silence inside the ship, combined with the drone's lights piercing the dense gloom, created an atmosphere that felt heavy, oppressive even. Every turn revealed another corridor leading into more shadow, each doorway framed in the wreckage of collapsed steel. At one point, the drone entered what was believed to be a communal mess hall. Tables bolted to the floor were still in place, though warped and tilted. Trays, unrecognizable save for their shape, were scattered across the corroded deck. Here, the feeling of absence was at its strongest. This was a place once filled with the chatter of men, the clatter of dishes, and the hum of routine. Now it was frozen silence. The kind that seemed to press against the walls and linger in the cold water, like a memory the lake itself refused to release. Farther aft, the drone navigated through tangled webs of wires, pipes, and twisted beams. Its operators had to guide it carefully to avoid snagging on the wreckage. This section of the ship bore scars that seemed more violent than other parts. Metal had been forced inward, crumpled in ways that seemed inconsistent with a vessel simply breaking apart under pressure. Observers debated whether these deformations suggested explosive forces caused by trapped air as the hull gave way, or something even less understood. Theories about hydraulic implosions surfaced, with experts noting that when a massive structure collapses at such depths, the sudden entry of water can exert unimaginable force, tearing steel apart as if it were thin foil. Still, there were those who could not shake the sense that what the drone revealed was not entirely mechanical in nature. The next significant discovery came in the remains of the navigation bridge. To reach it, the drone squeezed through a breach created when the ship tore in two, maneuvering into the skeletal remains of what had once been the command center. This space had fascinated researchers for years because it represented the last known location of Captain Ernest McSorley and his officers as they battled the storm. What the drone revealed was a place of destruction and disarray, yet one that carried echoes of purpose. Panels of instruments, corroded almost beyond recognition, still lined the bulkheads. The skeletons of dials and gauges stared blankly into the void. A chair, bolted firmly in place, stood askew, as though its occupant had been hurled against it by the final violent motions of the ship. For those watching the feed, this was a chilling reminder of the human drama that had unfolded here, a moment frozen forever in the silence of the depths. What unsettled the observers most, however, was the evidence of suddenness. Unlike wrecks where gradual sinking allowed for attempts at escape, the Fitzgerald bore signs of abrupt catastrophe. The lack of personal belongings scattered near exit points, the absence of any evidence suggesting men had tried to flee, all pointed to a ship that had gone down with shocking speed. This matched survivor accounts from other vessels in the storm, but seeing it within the wreck itself gave it new weight. The drone's footage captured spaces where life had been abruptly severed, places where men had no chance to act before the lake swallowed them whole. The oppressive atmosphere of these spaces carried a psychological impact, one that technology could record but not fully explain. The cargo holds offered their own mysteries. As the drone maneuvered into these vast chambers, it revealed landscapes that resembled cavernous ruins more than ship interiors. The iron ore pellets, once carefully contained, now formed mounds and rivers across the slanted floors. Yet, certain areas were strangely free of debris, as if something had swept through them. The walls bore marks not consistent with simple collapse. Long gouges, almost polished smooth, as though massive forces had pressed along them. In some areas, the ore had fused together into solid masses, a phenomenon likely caused by immense pressure and the interaction of minerals with the lake's water chemistry. To the human eye, however, these fused formations looked unnatural, like monuments erected within the ship's tomb. The effect was profoundly unnerving, suggesting forces at work far beyond what had been previously imagined. Moving still deeper, the drone reached areas no survey had ever managed to illuminate before. These included narrow maintenance corridors and auxiliary spaces, places where crew members had once performed tasks largely invisible to the outside world. The claustrophobia of these compartments was overwhelming even on camera. Walls pressed close, pipes ran in every direction, and debris blocked many passageways. Yet in these hidden recesses, the drone revealed details untouched for decades. Tools lay scattered across the deck plates as if dropped mid-task. A wrench rested beside a valve, corroded but recognizable. A notebook now fused into a rusted lump clung to the corner of a console. These details painted a haunting picture of a world interrupted without warning, a frozen moment of human activity overtaken by catastrophe. Perhaps the most terrifying discovery, however, was not a physical object but a pattern. As the drone mapped more and more of the interior, analysts on the surface began to notice strange alignments in the wreckage. Beams, walls, and collapsed panels had fallen in ways that seemed almost too symmetrical, too patterned for the randomness of destruction. Some suggested this was coincidence, the natural outcome of structural collapse under immense stresses, but others whispered about deeper mysteries, about the possibility that forces in the lake had shaped the wreck in ways beyond human comprehension. The patterns gave the impression of something deliberate, a hidden geometry etched into the ship's bones. Whether real or imagined, the psychological effect was undeniable. The Fitzgerald seemed less a wreck and more a monument sculpted by powers indifferent to human understanding. The drone's sensors added to the unease. As it lingered in certain compartments, instruments detected anomalies in the water, slight changes in temperature, fluctuations in density, even faint electrical disturbances. While these could be explained by natural processes, the fact that they appeared only near specific areas of the wreck gave them an unsettling significance. The operators noted that these anomalies sometimes coincided with the eerie sounds picked up by hydrophones, low rumbles and groans that echoed through the hull. When played back, these sounds had an uncanny resemblance to voices, distorted and drawn out, as if the wreck itself were trying to speak. Rational minds attributed this to resonance, the amplification of water movement within confined metal spaces. Yet for those listening in the control room, the effect was nothing short of chilling. As the mission continued, the drone encountered sections that seemed almost hostile to its presence. Narrow shafts funneled silt in sudden clouds that obscured visibility. Loose debris shifted unexpectedly as though disturbed by unseen currents. At one point, a length of collapsed piping swung in the wake of the drone, striking against the hull with a hollow clang that reverberated through the water. For a moment, it felt as though the ship had moved, as if disturbed by the intrusion into its dark interior. These moments underscored the fragility of the endeavor, reminding those at the surface that even in death, the Fitzgerald remained a place of danger and unpredictability. The implications of all this extended far beyond maritime history. The wreck, once a symbol of human loss, now stood as a reminder of forces still not fully understood. Engineers and scientists saw in the footage lessons about structural failure, hydrodynamics, and the sheer power of the Great Lakes. But for others, the discoveries awakened a deeper unease. The Fitzgerald seemed to embody the idea that the lake itself was alive in some sense, that it guarded its secrets with a patience and ferocity beyond human control. The patterns in the wreckage, the sounds in the water, the preservation of everyday objects, all these combined to create an impression that was less scientific artifact and more haunted relic. The hours of the drone's mission revealed one last haunting sight. In a forward compartment, half buried beneath collapsed beams, lay a lifeboat crushed almost beyond recognition. Its davits were twisted, its frame shattered, but parts of its structure remained intact. This discovery confirmed what had long been suspected. The crew had no time to launch the lifeboats. The ship went down so quickly, so violently, that survival was impossible. Seeing the ruined lifeboat inside the wreck was a stark reminder of the helplessness that defined the tragedy. It was a relic not of hope, but of futility, a symbol of how completely the lake had claimed the ship and her men. When the drone finally withdrew, pulling back through the wreck's torn hull and rising once more toward the lightless surface, those who had witnessed its journey were left shaken. They had entered a world preserved in the silence of deep water, a world where history, science, and dread converged. The Fitzgerald had revealed its insides, but what it showed was not closure. Instead, it deepened the mystery, raising questions not only about how the ship was lost, but about the forces that continue to shape her even in death. The terrifying discoveries did not resolve the story. They ensured that the ship would remain forever a symbol of the unknown waiting beneath the waves. The drone's departure from the wreck should have brought relief, yet the images it had gathered seemed to linger in the minds of those who had watched. In the control room aboard the support vessel, silence followed the end of the live feed. The Fitzgerald had spoken not in words, but in rust, in twisted steel, in silence and shadows. The deeper truth was that the wreck still resisted explanation, and that resistance created more unease than answers ever could. But even after the drone ascended toward the surface, the mission was far from over. Analysis of the data continued, and the more it was studied, the more disturbing questions arose about what had been discovered within those steel walls. High-resolution sonar maps were one of the drone's most valuable contributions. These revealed the full dimensions of compartments never before documented. Engineers and marine architects expected to find familiar layouts, cargo holds, passageways, machinery spaces. Yet what the scans revealed was stranger. Certain sections of the wreck appeared to have shifted internally. Bulkheads were warped into shapes that suggested torsion and rotation far beyond normal structural collapse. In some places, walls had folded inward, crushing compartments into forms that made no sense from an architectural perspective. The drone's mapping showed hallways that abruptly ended in spirals of bent steel, stairwells that seemed compressed into near-solid masses. To those who studied them, these distortions were almost biological in their appearance, as if the ship had been twisted like cartilage rather than steel. One of the most chilling aspects of the data involved the condition of the forward storage areas. These spaces, though never accessible during the voyage, were critical to the ship's operation. The drone captured imagery of collapsed partitions where ore had poured through like liquid stone. Yet, tucked in corners where gravity should have forced it away, the sonar registered voids. Cavities existed where physics dictated there should have been solid cargo. The absence of material in these places sparked new speculation. Did violent internal pressures vaporize or displace the ore? Could sudden implosions have hurled it into spaces beyond the wreck? Some suggested geological explanations, pointing to currents that scoured silt and pellets from their natural resting places. Others remained unsettled, noting the strange regularity of the voids, as though something had carved them deliberately. In the aftermath of the mission, the acoustic recordings continued to provoke debate. When analyzed by spectrograms, the low rumbles and groans seemed to follow patterns resembling rhythm. To some, this was easily explained as resonance of the ship's hollow compartments under fluctuating water pressures. But the uncanny timing of the sounds left others convinced something more complex was happening. The way certain vibrations coincided with the drone's movements felt responsive. Though no serious researcher would call it communication, the impression that the wreck was reacting to intrusion refused to fade. Audio engineers compared the recordings to seismic events, noting similarities to microtremors caused by shifting strata. If the Fitzgerald lay atop unstable ground, it could explain the uncanny noises. Yet, once again, the rational explanation did little to soothe the unease created by the auditory evidence. Back on the surface, the mission data revealed another dimension of the discovery: the environment around the wreck. The drone had documented not just the ship, but the immediate lakebed and water column. Here, too, anomalies surfaced. The sediment surrounding the Fitzgerald bore unusual patterns, concentric rings and channels that stretched outward from the wreck. To geologists, these might be the results of turbulent currents caused when the massive freighter struck bottom. Yet their persistence after nearly 50 years was perplexing. Normally, the lakebed would smooth itself over time, erasing scars. These patterns had endured, preserved as though shielded from natural processes. Some suggested the wreck's sheer bulk created eddies that perpetuated the disturbances. Others noted that the formations bore unsettling resemblance to impact craters, further fueling speculation about the violence of the ship's final descent. The drone's lights had also revealed life in these depths. While conditions seemed hostile, colonies of microorganisms thrived, clinging to the wreck in strange formations. These bacterial mats formed delicate filaments and globular masses, shimmering faintly in the camera beams. Marine biologists noted that such colonies were rare in freshwater wrecks, especially in such abundance. Their proliferation suggested the wreck was acting as an ecosystem unlike anything else in the lake. The mats themselves were harmless, yet their ghostly glow against rusted walls created a visual effect impossible to ignore. Observers described them as veins or networks pulsing faintly, lending the impression that the Fitzgerald still harbored life of its own. The biological reality was fascinating enough, but the psychological effect was unnerving. It was as though the ship itself breathed in the still waters. Artifacts, too, played a role in deepening the unease. Among the items imaged were small objects, mundane in life but transformed by the context of death. A pair of eyeglasses, their lenses fogged with corrosion, lay near a crushed passageway. A rusted thermos rested upright on a tilted deck, seemingly untouched despite decades of collapse. Even fragments of clothing were visible, clinging stubbornly to beams or trapped beneath debris. These objects were more haunting than the vast twisted steel. They reminded observers that the Fitzgerald was not just machinery, it was the home and workplace of men whose final moments had been lived in these corridors. Every artifact captured on film became a silent testament, amplifying the sense of intrusion into a space that was less wreckage and more crypt. The bridge section yielded details that struck particularly hard. Among the wreckage of instruments, one item stood out: a corroded compass, its dial still faintly visible beneath layers of rust. For decades, speculation had swirled about navigation in the storm. Whether instruments failed, whether readings were misinterpreted in the chaos. To see a compass preserved, locked forever at a bearing taken in those final moments, was profoundly unsettling. It was a frozen decision point, a direction fixed in rust, as if the ship itself carried within it the memory of its last struggle against the storm. Such an image transcended mere evidence. It carried symbolic weight, a reminder that choices made in desperation were now etched into steel and sediment, preserved by the cold silence of the lake. Even the drone's path through the wreck added to the sense of dread. Each maneuver into new compartments revealed the limits of human reach. The machine could go where no diver dared, but even it faced risks of entanglement or collapse. Several times, operators had to reverse course when debris shifted or passages narrowed too tightly. Watching the drone back out of constricted spaces stirred primal discomfort. It highlighted the fact that the Fitzgerald's interior was no place for the living. That intrusion into its hushed chambers bordered on sacrilege. Every success in navigation was shadowed by the knowledge that one wrong move could entomb the machine as surely as the men it sought to memorialize. The wreck's scale, too, bore a kind of terror. Seeing it in parts, bow, stern, collapsed cargo, often diminished its enormity. But the drone surveys reconstructed the whole, reminding observers that this was once the largest ship on the Great Lakes. To see such a titan torn and scattered across the lake bed emphasized the fury of the forces that destroyed it. The Fitzgerald had been considered invincible by some, a marvel of engineering. Its destruction, laid bare in images and sonar, underscored the fragility of even the greatest human creations. That recognition carried a sobering terror. If a ship of such size and strength could be obliterated in minutes, what hope did anything smaller have against the power of nature? As analysis deepened, the mission's implications grew beyond the wreck itself. Engineers began questioning long-held assumptions about shipbuilding for inland waters. The Fitzgerald had been a bulk carrier of staggering length, yet the stresses revealed in her wreckage suggested vulnerabilities. Her failure became a case study in the limits of design, one still debated among professionals decades later. But what unsettled those reviewing the drone's data was not just what it said about the past. It was what it suggested about the future. Could such catastrophes happen again? Were other ships vulnerable to the same combination of stress, storm, and structural weakness? The Fitzgerald's interior, mapped and imaged in haunting detail, became less a relic and more a warning. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the underwater drone exploring the Edmund Fitzgerald wreck discovery? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.